There I was standing in my ruined cornfield, watching that red Jeep Wrangler crush thousands of dollars worth of crops under its tires. The HOA president behind the wheel had the audacity to tell me she had every right to drive through my farm. 3 generations of my family's hard work meant nothing to her. But what she didn't know that morning was that I owned the land beneath their $1 million clubhouse. And I already had the bulldozer keys in my pocket. How did this entitled HOA tyrant end up watching me tear down their precious infinity pool, while the entire neighborhood cheered me on? My name is Frank Harmon, 58 years old and the proud owner of Harmon Family Farms. My grandfather purchased these 200 acres in 1937 during the tail end of the Great Depression. He paid cash, money he'd saved penny by penny, working double shifts at the factory while growing food for his family on rented land. This wasn't just any farm to us. This was our heritage, our legacy. The soil here contains my family's blood, sweat, and tears. I still have the calluses to prove it, and so did my father before me, and his father before him. For over 80 years we've grown the corn, soybeans, and wheat that fed this community and half the county. Back when I was a boy, our farm was surrounded by other family farms and open countryside. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the road, and everybody understood the unwritten rules of rural life. Respect property lines, help when needed, and recognize that farming means early mornings, occasional dust, and the honest smells of working the land. All that changed 15 years ago when developers broke ground on Maple Creek Estates. Suddenly, my eastern property line faced cookie-cutter mansions with 3-car garages and pristine lawns that never saw children playing on them. They built stone entrance gates with gilded letters and streets with pretentious names like Grand Wellington Drive and Buckingham Court. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I tried to be reasonable. Times change and farmers understand better than most that you have to adapt or die. I agreed to maintain a 50-foot buffer zone of wildflowers between my crops and their properties to make the transition more aesthetic. I even let them use my Northfield for their 4th of July picnics and Easter egg hunts. Most of the residents were decent enough. Some even appreciated having pastoral views from their back windows. A few would bring their grandchildren to watch the harvest or buy fresh sweet corn from my roadside stand. But everything changed when Barbara Whitfield, a 55-year-old former corporate executive with zero understanding of agriculture, became HOA president last year. From her first day in office, Barbara treated my multi-generational farm like it was some kind of eyesore, degrading her precious property values. The complaint letters started arriving weekly. My tractors were too loud during planting season, the dust during dry spells was unacceptable, and God forbid the occasional whiff of natural fertilizer reached her synthetic landscape. I tried explaining politely that the farm had been here 80 years before the first foundation was poured at Maple Creek Estates. I invited her to visit, to understand what we do and why certain aspects of farming can't be scheduled around HOA convenience. She declined, saying her time was too valuable for agricultural tourism. That should have been my warning that things would only get worse. But even I couldn't have predicted just how far Barbara would go to assert her imagined authority over my land. It happened on August 23 last year. A date now burned into my memory alongside my anniversary and my children's birthdays. The corn was perfect that season, nearly 8 feet tall, thick and golden, heavy with promise. After 2 years of drought followed by one of flooding, we were finally looking at a bumper crop that would let me pay off the new irrigation system, and maybe even put something away for my grandson Jake's college fund. I was out checking moisture levels in the southeast field, the one that borders Maple Creek Estates. The morning was clear and cool, a blessing in late summer, and I was feeling good about our prospects. That's when I heard it, an engine revving aggressively. Not the steady rumble of farm equipment, but the angry snarl of something built for show rather than work. At first I thought maybe one of the neighborhood teenagers had driven off-road by mistake. It wouldn't be the first time some kid had accidentally veered onto farm property, though usually, they were apologetic and quick to leave. I crested the rise between fields and froze in disbelief. A bright red Jeep Wrangler with oversized tires and HOA vanity plates was cutting a destructive path straight through my prime cornfield. The driver wasn't lost or confused. They were deliberately mowing down row after row of fully mature corn, carving what looked like a joyriding path through my livelihood. I radioed Jake, who was working the north section, my voice shaking with a mixture of shock and rage. "Someone's driving through the southeast corn. Get down here now. By the time Jake arrived in his pickup, I had already reached the edge of the destruction. The Jeep had finally stopped, not out of consideration, but because it had gotten stuck in a muddy depression where the irrigation line ran. Nearly 3 acres of corn lay flattened in its wake. More than $32,000 worth of crops destroyed in a matter of minutes. As we approached, the driver's door swung open, and out stepped Barbara Whitfield. She wore a crisp blue blazer with the Maple Creek Estates logo embroidered on the pocket, pressed khaki pants, and what looked like brand new hiking boots that had clearly never seen actual trail use. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, not a strand out of place despite her vehicular rampage. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" I shouted, my hands shaking as I surveyed the agricultural carnage surrounding us. Barbara brushed corn silk from her sleeve with manicured fingers and replied with chilling casualness, "I'm conducting an official HOA property line inspection. We've had complaints about your farming encroaching on community land." Jake, normally the calm one in our family, exploded. "There's a service road around the perimeter specifically for access. You've just destroyed our entire southeast section." "Don't be so dramatic," she said, rolling her eyes like we were children overreacting to a minor inconvenience. "The HOA has every right to access and inspect our boundaries, and I needed to see it firsthand. Your outdated farming operation is affecting our residents' quality of life and property values. This needed to be addressed." When I pointed out that she was trespassing and had caused significant criminal damage to our crops, she actually laughed. "Trespassing? Please. I'm ensuring compliance with our community standards." She reached into her blazer pocket and handed me her business card, the HOA logo embossed in gold. "Send any concerns to our legal department. This is simply a boundary dispute." She turned her back on us and pulled out her phone, completely dismissing the destruction surrounding her. I heard her call a towing service, giving her location as the edge of Harmon Farm where it meets Maple Creek Estates property. The tow truck arrived 30 minutes later, bringing 2 more HOA board members, who stood with their arms crossed, looking at us like we were the problem. The extraction of Barbara's stuck Jeep caused even more damage, tearing up additional rows of corn and digging deep ruts in the soil that would take seasons to repair. As she was leaving, Barbara turned back and delivered a final insult. "Oh, and we'll be sending you a bill for the towing. Your poorly maintained field damaged my vehicle's undercarriage. You really should post warning signs about the irrigation." That night I couldn't sleep. Acres of prime corn were gone. $32,000 of income erased in one entitled woman's joyride. The sheriff had come out, taken photos, and filed a report, but called it a civil matter despite the clear destruction of property. My insurance adjuster estimated the damage at $32,000 for lost crops, plus at least $5,000 for soil remediation to repair the compacted ruts. I spent the next 3 days in a fog of anger and helplessness. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by the sickening realization that Barbara would likely face no real consequences. The HOA had better lawyers than I could afford, and they would drag out any civil suit until I ran out of money or patience. On the 4th day, Jake suggested we review all our property documents to prepare for a potential legal battle. "We need to know exactly where our boundaries are, Grandpa. If she's claiming we encroached on their land, we need to prove her wrong." It seemed like busy work to distract me from my anger, but I agreed. We pulled out every document related to the farm deeds, surveys, tax records, and the original sale documents from when the developers bought the adjacent property from Creek Estates. I even drove to the county records office to retrieve the original plat maps from when the subdivision was approved. What I discovered made my heart race like it hadn't since Martha said yes to my proposal 45 years ago. When they built Maple Creek Estates, the developer had made a catastrophic error. Their crown jewel, a 12,000 square foot clubhouse with an infinity pool, tennis courts, and a fitness center, was built partially on a 2.8-acre parcel that legally belonged to me. The parcel had a complicated history. In 1962, my father briefly sold it to my uncle during a difficult financial period with a buyback agreement. 2 years later, it was deeded back to our family, but this transaction created a separate legal description in the county records. When the developers conducted their survey 15 years ago, they had somehow missed this separate parcel entirely. Their fancy clubhouse, the heart of the community and the feature most prominently displayed in their marketing materials, encroached a full 75 feet onto my land. The eastern wall of the main building, half their infinity pool, and one entire tennis court were sitting on property that had been in my family for generations. I could hardly believe it. I checked and rechecked the surveys, comparing the original property descriptions with the current county GIS maps. There was no mistake. The so-called premier amenity of Maple Creek Estates was trespassing on my land, far more significantly than my corn had ever encroached on theirs. I called Samuel Richardson, the attorney who had represented our family for decades. He verified my findings and was astonished. "Frank, this isn't a minor encroachment. They built $1 million facility partially on your land without permission or compensation. You have full legal rights to demand its removal." "What about getting compensated for my crops?" I asked. "The crop damage gives you leverage," he said. "But this clubhouse situation," he whistled through his teeth, "that's your nuclear option. They'll fight the crop damage claim, but they can't argue with property deeds and surveys recorded at the county level." For the first time since watching Barbara's Jeep flatten my corn, I felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about respect for boundaries, for property rights, for the agricultural heritage that sustained this community long before fancy subdivisions arrived. Armed with certified surveys, property deeds, and a letter from Samuel outlining my legal position, I requested an emergency meeting with the HOA board. They reluctantly agreed, probably expecting me to beg for compensation for my damaged crops. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Tuesday in the very clubhouse that sat partially on my land. 5 board members waited at a mahogany table in their executive conference room, with Barbara at the head, looking annoyed at what she called unnecessary drama. When I walked in with my folder of documents, she immediately began, "Mr. Harmon, we understand you're upset about our necessary property line inspection, but this meeting is merely a courtesy. Our legal team has determined that." I cut her off by spreading the certified survey maps across their polished table. "Before you continue, I should inform you that you are all currently trespassing," I said calmly. The room went silent. Barbara blinked rapidly, the first sign of uncertainty I'd ever seen on her face. "What exactly are you implying?" asked James Wilson, the HOA vice president, a retired engineer who had always been civil in our few interactions. I explained the situation methodically. Their clubhouse, their community showpiece, was built illegally on my land. I owned the ground beneath half the building, including most of their infinity pool and the eastern tennis court. "That's absurd." Barbara snapped, her composure cracking. "The developer assured us all property lines were verified before construction." "The developer made a critical error," I replied, sliding the certified survey toward her. "This parcel was under a separate deed number due to a temporary transfer within my family in the 1960s. Their surveyors missed it entirely." I turned to look each board member in the eye. "And now you have a choice. Either compensate me fully for my destroyed crops and sign a new agreement respecting my farm's operation, or I'll exercise my legal right to reclaim my property, which means removing everything on it." Barbara laughed nervously, glancing at the other board members for support. "You can't possibly expect to tear down $1 million clubhouse over some corn." "I've already filed the necessary legal paperwork," I replied, my voice steady. "You have 48 hours to accept my terms, or my bulldozer starts removing what's on my land." James Wilson leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing, Frank?" I laid out my terms clearly. $50,000 compensation for my destroyed crops and soil remediation. Barbara's immediate resignation from the board. A formal apology in the community newsletter. A new easement agreement allowing the clubhouse to remain, with annual payments of $15,000. A good neighbor policy respecting normal farming operations. Barbara slammed her hand on the table. "This is extortion. We'll countersue for harassment." "Please do," I replied calmly. "I look forward to explaining to a judge how you personally destroyed $32,000 worth of my crops while trespassing, then had the audacity to demand I pay for the towing bill." They called an emergency executive session, asking me to leave while they discussed. Through the glass doors of the conference room, I could see heated arguments erupting. Barbara was waving her arms, her face red with fury, while James and 2 other members appeared to be urging caution. The next morning, instead of a settlement offer, I received a certified letter. The HOA was rejecting my preposterous claims and threatened countersuits for fabricating boundary disputes and making terroristic threats against community property. Barbara had convinced the board to fight rather than negotiate. The letter ended with a warning that any attempt to approach the clubhouse with construction equipment or destructive intent would result in immediate legal action and criminal charges. I called Samuel, who was outraged but not surprised. "They're bluffing, Frank," he said. "The surveys are clear. I'll file for an emergency injunction today confirming the fight was just beginning. Your property rights in the encroachment." 3 days later, we had our day in court. Judge Harriet Michaels, a no-nonsense woman who had grown up on a dairy farm herself, reviewed the documentation and listened to arguments from both sides. The HOA's attorney tried to claim adverse possession and public necessity, but these arguments fell apart under the judge's questioning. "The encroachment is less than 15 years old," Judge Michaels noted. "State law requires 20 years for adverse possession claims. As for public necessity, that applies to government entities, not private homeowners associations." Her ruling was unequivocal. She confirmed that I owned the land, that the clubhouse substantially encroached on my property, and that I had the legal right to remove the encroachment if we couldn't reach an agreement. The judge gave the HOA one final chance to negotiate in good faith before allowing me to proceed with removal. "I strongly encourage the parties to reach a settlement," she said, looking directly at Barbara. "The law is clear on Mr. Harmon's property rights in this matter." Emboldened by the court ruling, I presented my final offer to the HOA board: $50,000 in compensation for my destroyed crops and soil remediation, Barbara's immediate resignation, a formal apology in the community newsletter, a new easement agreement allowing the clubhouse to remain with annual payments of $115,000, and a good neighbor policy respecting normal farming operations. I gave them 24 hours to decide, a deadline the judge had deemed reasonable given the circumstances. That evening, residents began calling me. They had received an emergency HOA email from Barbara, characterizing me as a vindictive farmer trying to extort the community, and announcing an emergency assessment of $20,000 per household to fight my fraudulent claims. Several homeowners asked to see my documentation. When I showed them the surveys, property records, and court order, many were horrified at how Barbara had misrepresented the situation. By midnight, residents were organizing their own emergency meeting, without Barbara, to discuss the facts and options. When no acceptance came by my deadline, I had no choice but to follow through. At 7 a.m. the next morning, I drove my yellow Caterpillar D8 bulldozer down the main road toward the clubhouse. I was flanked by Samuel and the county sheriff, who carried copies of the court order authorizing me to remove encroachments on my property. Word had spread throughout the community. Local news cameras had somehow gotten wind of the situation, probably tipped off by one of the residents. Reporters lined the street as homeowners gathered to watch the confrontation unfold. Some looked angry, others curious, and a surprising number seemed supportive of my position after learning the facts. Barbara stood on the clubhouse steps with 2 security guards, looking both furious and terrified as the rumbling bulldozer approached. She wore the same blue blazer as the day she destroyed my crops, a detail that wasn't lost on me. I positioned the bulldozer at the property line, engine rumbling. The sheriff approached Barbara with the court order while Samuel used a bullhorn to announce, "This is your final opportunity to accept Mr. Harmon's reasonable terms before legal removal of the encroachment begins." Barbara snatched the papers and screamed, "You'll regret this. We'll sue you for everything you own." I put the bulldozer in gear and moved forward, the blade lowering toward the corner of the infinity pool. The crowd fell silent as the metal edge made contact with concrete. Water began spilling out as the pool wall cracked under pressure. I felt no joy, only the grim satisfaction of justice being served after my own property had been so carelessly destroyed. As the blade touched the clubhouse foundation, a man in a suit came running from the crowd, waving frantically. It was James Wilson, the HOA vice president. "Stop! We accept your terms," he shouted. The board voted to remove Barbara and accept all conditions. I shut down the bulldozer. The damage was minimal, just a cracked pool corner that could be repaired. James explained that homeowners had held an emergency vote, that morning after reviewing the court documents and property records overnight. They had voted 87% in favor of removing Barbara from the board and accepting my terms. Barbara was escorted from the property by the same security guards who had stood with her moments before. She continued shouting threats of lawsuits against everyone involved as she got into her red Jeep, the same vehicle that had destroyed my crops. The crowd of residents actually applauded as she drove away, tires squealing on the asphalt. James and the new acting board president, Eleanor Chambers, a retired judge, approached me with hands extended. On behalf of Maple Creek Estates, we offer our sincere apologies for the damage to your crops and the disrespect shown to your property rights, Eleanor said formally. We accept all your terms and would like to begin rebuilding a relationship of mutual respect. The new board not only agreed to my original terms but added provisions of their own. An annual Farm Heritage Day where community residents could learn about agriculture, a monthly farmers market in the Clubhouse parking lot featuring my produce and other local growers, educational programs with local schools about farming and food production, and renaming their community park Harmon Fields, in recognition of my family's agricultural legacy. Within a week, I received full compensation for my damaged crops. The formal apology was published in both the community newsletter and a local newspaper. Most satisfying was the new monument they installed at the community entrance, a bronze plaque honoring the agricultural heritage of the land and acknowledging the Harmon family's contributions since 1937. Barbara sold her house within a month and moved to Florida, where I hear she's already battling with her beachfront condo association over sea turtle lighting restrictions. Meanwhile, the relationship between my farm and Maple Creek Estates has never been better. Residents now understand and appreciate the seasonal rhythms of agriculture. Many volunteer during harvest or bring their grandchildren to learn about farming. The annual Farm Heritage Day has become the community's most popular event, drawing visitors from neighboring counties. The farmers market is thriving, providing me with a reliable direct-to-consumer revenue stream that has actually increased my farm's profitability. Several residents have even started community garden plots, where I teach sustainable growing practices. Most importantly, there's mutual respect. The new HOA leadership understands that their luxury homes and my working farm can coexist when boundaries, both physical and social, are properly recognized. Jake, who initially wanted me to sue for millions, now admits this resolution was better for everyone. You didn't just win a battle, Grandpa, he told me recently. You changed their perspective. That's worth more than money. Sometimes you have to bring a bulldozer to get respect. I didn't want to destroy their clubhouse, but I needed to show that generations of agricultural heritage can't be casually flattened by entitlement and ignorance. If you're facing unreasonable demands from an HOA, or anyone who doesn't respect your property rights, remember, know your boundaries, document everything, and don't be afraid to stand your ground, even if it means firing up the bulldozer.